Both factions are thought to be gaining momentum in the war. Islamists are thought to have recruited tens of thousands of foreigners, potentially causing an intelligence headache back in their homelands. RT's Tessa Arcilia reports from London.
A British jihadist known as Abu Sulaiman al-Britani is believed to be the first Briton to have carried out a suicide attack in Syria after a vehicle packed with explosives was taken to a prison, allowing some 300 prisoners to escape. Now, British citizens, along with other Europeans traveling to Syria, some as young as 16 and fighting alongside jihadist groups, have long been a concern for authorities. It's believed now that there are about 350 Britons over there, making up the largest contingent of some 1,000 Westerners. And this new development reinforces the urgency expressed by governments here in having to deal with a specific group of jihadists carrying their country's passport.
I think that it's significant in the fact the information has finally come out that we're seeing this actually happen in Syria. However, given the trends that we've seen in Syria over the past few years, it's not surprising that we're seeing British individuals or foreign individuals more generally becoming involved in suicide operations on the ground. I think if we compare this particular conflict in Syria with the other jihadi battlefields that we've seen around the world, certainly the rapidity with which we've seen the large numbers of foreigners being drawn to the battlefield is, from my perspective, unprecedented. The numbers certainly that we're hearing quoted about are new for British intelligence, and it presents a very difficult picture for them to manage.
In sounding the alarm over this phenomenon, authorities are increasingly worried about what happens when these individuals return home. Now, a group of Britons have already threatened to carry out terrorist attacks in the UK, and this is believed to be the first direct threats to come out of Syria. Reporting from London, I'm Tessa Arcilia.
Hellfire missiles, drones and fighter jets. The Iraqi military is about to get an upgrade from the United States. The lethal aid is meant to help Baghdad fight al-Qaeda-linked groups who are gaining territories both in Iraq and, crucially, in Syria too. Ghana Chichikan reports.
The Iraqi Prime Minister asked for help because al-Qaeda is not just active in Iraq, but it's gaining territory to an extent that they're talking about an Islamic State. The U.S. is now rushing dozens of Hellfire missiles and surveillance drones to the Iraqi government to combat this jihadist insurgency there. The CIA is also reportedly helping them with targets inside Iraq. But al-Qaeda is gaining momentum in Iraq largely because they've been able to establish a strong foothold in the neighboring Syria. So you have, let's say, a jihadist group called the State of Iraq and Levant, controlling territory both in Iraq and Syria. Although the situation in Syria is worse and is critical in that regard, the Syrian government, of course, cannot count on Washington's help in fighting terror. Quite the opposite. These radical groups have taken advantage of the arms that the so-called Friends of Syria were sending to the Syrian opposition, and now Washington is talking about negotiating with the Islamic Front in Syria, which includes groups that demand a hardline Sharia state. Washington says the U.S. can engage with them because they've not been designated as terrorists by the State Department. But does that mean that they don't share similar goals as those who are designated as terrorists? So lots of questions. And overall, it's a tricky situation where extremists in Syria have benefited from U.S. actions, and yet Washington is now up in arms trying to help the Iraqi government essentially fight the same forces.
A little earlier, I spoke to author and journalist Gerda Coleman, who's been covering the Middle East extensively. He told me Washington's policy on Syria is inconsistent.
In Syria, it's very clear that NATO and the United States have been sponsoring the terrorists from the very, very start. The bulk of the opposition, the so-called opposition in Syria, is composed of al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda-linked groups. This is not a secret. It's even been admitted by the US State Department, for example. So it is quite surprising that the US would be trying to get rid of al-Qaeda in Iraq, when in fact the al-Qaeda in Iraq is one of the bases of the so-called insurgency in Syria that the US is backing.
You're listening to the AMB network. The future is now.
begin with a new revelation that has travelers passing through Canadian airports considering going offline. A document leaked by Edward Snowden was just released by CBC News in Canada, showing that Canada's electronic spy agency used information from the free internet service at a major Canadian airport to track the wireless devices of thousands of ordinary online passengers for days after they left the terminal. The operation by the Communications Security Establishment Canada, or CSEC, was revealed in a PowerPoint obtained by CBC News. The documents show that the agency collected metadata on individuals when they logged on the internet at an international airport and used that information to track the people for over 2 weeks. Cybersecurity experts in Canada said this is certainly unlawful. And before this news broke, CSEC Chief John Forster sounded like he was in agreement.
CSEC, under its legislation, cannot target Canadians anywhere in the world or anyone in Canada, including visitors to Canada.
Yet, CBC analysts say these new documents show that airline passengers at a Canadian airport are clearly in Canada. The CSEC issued a statement in response to the report saying that no Canadians or foreign travelers were tracked, no Canadian communications were or are targeted, collected, or used. And as the CSEC faces tough questions, the U.S. is beginning to take its own look at its own surveillance agencies. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel announced yesterday that President Obama will nominate Navy Vice Admiral Mike Rogers as the next director of the National Security Agency. This is contrary to the White House-appointed review panel's recommendation to place a civilian as the head of the NSA. The Defense Secretary also announced that Richard Leggett, a civilian, has been selected to serve as the Deputy Director of the NSA. You might remember Leggett from an interview that aired on 60 Minutes in December. He was asked if the U.S. should strike a deal with Edward Snowden.
So my personal view is, yes, it's worth having a conversation about. I would need assurances that the remainder of the data could be secured, and my bar for those assurances would be very high. It would be more than just an assertion on his part.
These changes come just 2 weeks after President Obama's speech to reform the government's surveillance program. Vice Admiral Mike Rogers will have to undergo a Senate confirmation. Leggett will not.
President Obama is staying away from the Sochi Olympics, but this morning we're learning more about his views on Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Obama says he and his counterpart do work together and have a respectful relationship. The president told NBC Putin wants to look like a tough guy, calling it part of his shtick back home politically. He added, quote, U.S. politicians have a different style. We tend to smile once in a while, which was very interesting comment by the president. Yeah, they don't have the warmest of relations.
And he pointed that out.
Yes.
And problems between the two countries.
Indeed.
Welcome to the Power Blog site, February 7th, 2014. The Canadians lied about their H5N1 patient not having respiratory symptoms. Ahead of print today from the United States Centers for Disease Control, came out this report which sets the record clear what happened with this lady who came back from China. It says the patient initially sought care for respiratory symptoms. The probable cause of death was listed as meningoencephalitis. It says here clearly she initially sought care for respiratory symptoms. And if we go look at the PDF that came along with this, we get a little bit more information. During the return flight, the individual experienced symptoms of malaise, chest pain, now pay attention, remember that one, chest pain and fever, and presented to the local emergency department. Now let's compare that to what was reported in Canadian news. Obviously these people got their information from the government. CTV News. So we'll scroll down. It said the individual, zoom in here just a little bit, just to make it absolutely clear to people. The individual started feeling unwell on the flight home and was later admitted to the hospital where her condition quickly deteriorated. The patient's initial symptoms included fever, malaise, and headache. There were no respiratory symptoms. So what they left out of this was that she had chest pain, and then they flat out lied that there were no respiratory symptoms. I'd say incredible, but it's not incredible. Over and over again, the Canadians reported that this woman did not have respiratory symptoms. It's clear that she did. It's prima facie evidence that the Canadian officials deliberately hid the fact she had chest pains and that she did have respiratory symptoms. Let me zoom up this a little bit. Oops. So, why did the Canadian officials lie? Obviously, and not surprisingly, they didn't think that their subjects could handle the truth. But more importantly, such deceptions are done to allow those who do know the facts to control and constrain a supply chain that might be heavily overtaxed and burdened by public reaction. The Canadian healthcare system likely decided it was cheaper to risk the lives of Canadian airline passengers than it was to pay for all those people running to their government-paid healthcare system for treatment. Now, for us in the United States, now with Obamacare, expect no difference from our own government. The rule is clear. Never, ever, never accept your government's assurance of safety or lack of risk as the sole basis for not visiting a doctor if there is some chance you are exposed to a transmittable disease. Furthermore, don't let your doctor accept the government's assurances either. Make your doctor think for him or herself. Yeah, it's very reminiscent of what happened in the aftermath of the World Trade Towers coming down and the government assuring people that all that dust was safe. Now we know it's not. Now, it's safe to assume the Canadians initially thought that this was an H7N9 case and that to prevent rumors of an H7N9 case spreading around, her probable cause of death was listed as meningoencephalitis instead. And clearly, again, here it says in the CD report, the patient initially sought care for respiratory systems. However, the probable cause of death was listed as meningoencephalitis, an unusual outcome. We have source documents listed here. Be concerned.
Piers Morgan invited Janet Mock to come on his program again and talk about or debate some of the criticism she had over the previous interview she had on his program. So previously she went on to promote her book and she wanted to talk about the struggles of the transgender community. And in the process of doing that, Piers Morgan asked her some questions that the transgender community thought were extremely insensitive, and some people thought it was actually cruel. If you don't remember that, we have a little mashup of how the interview went. Let's take a quick look at that.
So this is the amazing thing about it. Had I not known anything about your story, I would have had absolutely not a clue that you had ever been a boy, a male. Which makes me absolutely believe you should always have been a woman. And that must have been what you felt when you were young. Did you ever feel like, say, I can't deal with this, I'm going to have to go back to being a boy, Charles? At what point did you change your name? Here you go. This takes a lot of courage. You're going through school. You've gone from Charles to Janet, from boys' clothes to girls' clothes. And you've coped with all the teasing and the bullying. You come through, and it's made you, I guess, strong in your head enough to say, I'm going to go through properly with this and become a woman. I'm going to have a transgender operation, which is a huge thing to do at 18. Tell me how you felt when you actually were approaching the operation. What was the moment after you had it, when you looked in the mirror and were finally able to think, wow, that is who I'm supposed to be?
So the majority of the questions focused on her transition from a male to a female, and people were offended by that because they felt that he neglected to talk about real issues that impact the transgender community, including unemployment, including some of the violence against transgender people. So what did you think about the original interview?
I mean, look, I am a fairly late comer to this story, so was it the ideal interview that many people in the transgender community wanted? I guess probably not, but they don't have a show. Piers Morgan has a show. And the notion